Hi, third graders. Today we are going to be finishing Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. We are reading chapters 29 and 30, and that is the end of the book. Where we had left off, Mike TV had shrunken himself. He zapped himself through the TV and was shrunk and was only about an inch high in his mom's hand. And he had to be taken away to be stretched by like a stretching machine. And Mr. Strong is like, well, he'll be tall, but he'll be super skinny because when you stretch, imagine when you stretch out slime or gum and you stretch it, it's thick at the beginning, and then as you go, it gets super, 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 super thin, and if you stretch it far enough, usually it'll break in the middle. He's going to be stretched. And then Charlie's like, well, I'm the last one. And Mr. Wonka's like, you've won, let's go. And they get in the elevator, and he's like, I've never pushed this button, but I've been tempted to. And he pushes the button for up and out, and they shoot out of the roof of the factory and are above the town and the factory, and they see the other kids leaving the factory as well. So chapter 29 is called The Other Children Go Home. We must go down and take a look at our little friends before we do anything, said Mr. Wonka. He pressed a different button, and the elevator dropped lower, and soon it was hovering just above the entrance gates of the factory. Looking down now, Charlie could see the children and their parents standing in a little group just inside the gates. I can only see 3, he said. Who's missing? I expect it's Mike TV, said Mr. Wonka. But he'll be coming along soon. Do you see the trucks? Mr. Wonka pointed to a line of gigantic covered vans parked nearby. Yes, Charlie said. What are they for? Don't you remember what it said in the golden ticket? Every child goes home with a lifetime supply of candy. There's 1 truckload for each of them, loaded to the brim. Aha, Mr. Wonka went on. There goes our friend Augustus Gloop. Do you see him? He's getting into the first truck with his mother and father. You mean he's really all right? Asked Charlie, astonished. Even after going up that awful pipe? He's very much all right, said Mr. Wonka. He's changed, said Grandpa Joe, peering down through the glass wall of the elevator. He used to be fat. Now he's thin as a straw. Of course he's changed, said Mr. Wonka, laughing. He got squeezed in the pipe, don't you remember? And look, there goes Miss Violet Beauregard, the great gum chewer. It seems as though I managed to de-juice her after all. I'm so glad, and how healthy she looks, much better than before. But she's purple in the face, cried Grandpa Joe. So she is, said Mr. Wonka. Ah, well, there's nothing we can do about that. Good gracious, cried Charlie. Look at poor Veruca Salt and Mr. and Mrs. Salt. They're simply covered in garbage. And here comes Mike TV, said Grandpa Joe. Good heavens, what have they done to him? He's about 10 feet tall and as thin as a wire. They've overstretched him on the gum stretching machine, said Mr. Wonka. How very careless. But how dreadful for him. So there's a picture of all of them. So up first, if I can get so I can see. Here is Augustus Gloop. He used to be super, 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 super fat, as described in the book. And you can see he's holding his pants out. Right here's where his pants are, and you can see where he is. So he's lost a lot of weight. Then here is Violet Beauregard. She is purple. She no longer is as round as a ball, a blueberry, but she is still purple. Here is the Salt family, Mr. and Mrs. Salt, and then Veruca Salt. They are covered in trash because they went down the garbage chute. And lastly is Mike TV, who is 10 feet tall. So I'm 5'7", and usually I give this example when I'm in class, but 10 feet is super tall. That would be like almost 2 of me stacked on top of each other. Very, very, very tall. And he's super skinny. I think he kind of looks like a skeleton. But that's what happened to all of them. Nonsense, said Mr. Wonka. He's very lucky. Every basketball team in the country will be trying to get him. But now, he said, it is time we left these 4 silly children. I have something very important to talk to you about, my dear Charlie. Mr. Wonka pressed another button, and the elevator swung towards the sky. Chapter 30. Charlie's Chocolate Factory. The great glass elevator was now hovering high out of the inside of the town. Inside the elevator stood Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe, and little Charlie. And how I love my chocolate factory, said Mr. Wonka, gazing down. Then he paused, and he turned around and looked at Charlie with the most serious expression on his face. Do you love it, Charlie? He asked. Oh, yes, cried Charlie. I think it's the most wonderful place in the whole world. I'm very pleased to hear you say that, said Mr. Wonka, looking more serious than ever. He went on staring at Charlie. Yes, he said, I am very pleased indeed to hear you say that, and now I shall tell you why. Mr. Wonka cocked his head to one side, and all at once the tiny twinkling wrinkles in his smile appeared around the corners of his eyes, and he said, You see, my dear boy, I have decided to make you a present of this whole place. As soon as you're old enough to run it, the entire factory will become yours. Charlie stared at Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. It's quite true, Mr. Wonka said, smiling broadly now. I really am giving it to you. That's all right, isn't it? Giving it to him, gasped Grandpa Joe. You must be joking. I'm not joking, sir. I'm deadly serious. But, why should you want to give your factory to little Charlie? Listen, Mr. Wonka said. I'm an old man. I'm much older than you think. I can't go on forever. I've got no children of my own, no family at all. So who is going to run a factory when I get too old to do it myself? Someone's got to keep it going, if only for the sake of the Oompa Loompas. Mind you, there are thousands of clever men who would give anything for the chance to come in and take over for me. But I don't want that sort of person. I don't want a grown-up person at all. A grown-up won't listen to me. He won't learn. He will try to do things his own way and not mine. So I have to have a child. I want a good, sensible, loving child, one to whom I can tell all my most precious candy-making secrets, while I'm still alive. So that is why you sent out the golden tickets, cried Charlie. Exactly, said Mr. Wonka. I decided to invite 5 children to the factory, and the one I liked best at the end of the day would be the winner. But Mr. Wonka, stammered Grandpa Joe, do you really and truly mean that you're giving the whole of this enormous factory to little Charlie after all? There's no time for arguments, cried Mr. Wonka. We must go at once and fetch the rest of the family, Charlie's father and his mother, and anyone else that's around. They can all live in the factory from now on. They can all help to run it until Charlie's old enough to do it by himself. Where do you live, Charlie? Charlie peered down through the glass elevator at the snow-covered houses that lay below. It's over there, he said, pointing. It's that little cottage right at the edge of the town, the tiny little one. I see it, cried Mr. Wonka as he pressed some more buttons and the elevator shot down toward Charlie's house. I'm afraid my mother won't come with us, Charlie said sadly. Why ever not? Because she won't leave Grandma Josephine and Grandma Georgina and Grandpa George. But they must come too. They can't, Charlie said. They're very old and they haven't been out of bed for 20 years. Then we'll take the bed along as well, with them in it, said Mr. Wonka. There's plenty of room in this elevator for a bed. You couldn't get a bed out of the house, said Grandpa Joe. It won't go through the door. You mustn't be sad, cried Mr. Wonka. Nothing's impossible. Just you watch. The elevator was now hovering over the roof of the Bucket's little house. What are you going to do? Cried Charlie. I'm going right on in to fetch them, said Mr. Wonka. How? Asked Grandpa Joe. Through the roof, said Mr. Wonka, pressing another button. No, shouted Charlie. Stop, shouted Grandpa Joe. Crash went the elevator right down through the roof of the house into the old people's bedroom. Showers of dust and broken tiles and bits of wood and cockroaches and spiders and bricks and cement went raining down on the 3 old ones who were lying in bed. Each of them thought that the end of the world had come. Grandma Georgine fainted. Grandma Josephine dropped the false teeth. Grandpa George put his head under a blanket, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came rushing in from the next room. Save us! Cried Grandma Josephine. Calm yourself, my darling wife, said Grandpa Joe, stepping out of the elevator. It's only us. Mother! Cried Charlie, rushing into Mrs. Bucket's arms. Mother! Mother! Listen to what's happened. We're all going back to live at Mr. Wonka's factory, and we're going to help him run it, and he's given it all to me. And... What are you talking about? Said Mrs. Bucket. Just look at our house, cried poor Mr. Bucket. It's in ruins. My dear sir, said Mr. Wonka, jumping forward and shaking Mr. Bucket warmly in the hand. I'm so very glad to meet you. You mustn't worry about your house. From now on, you're never going to need it again, anyway. Who is this crazy man? Screamed Grandma Josephine. He could have killed us all. This, said Grandpa Joe, is Mr. Willy Wonka himself. It took quite a time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to explain to everyone exactly what had happened all day, and even though they all refused to ride back to the factory in the elevator, even then, I'd rather die in my bed, shuddered Grandma Josephine. So would I, cried Grandma Georgina. I refuse to go, announced Grandpa George. So Mr. Wonka and Grandpa Joe and Charlie, taking no notice of their screams, simply pushed the bed into the elevator. They pushed Mr. and Mrs. Bucket in after it. Then they got in themselves. Mr. Wonka pressed a button. The doors closed. Grandma Georgina screamed, and the elevator rose up to the top floor and shot through the hole in the roof, out into the open sky. Charlie climbed onto the bed and tried to calm the three old people, who were still petrified with fear. Please don't be scared, he said. It's quite safe, and we're going to the most wonderful place in the world. Charlie's right, said Grandpa Joe. Will there be anything to eat when we get there? Asked Grandma Georgina. I'm starving. The whole family's starving. Anything to eat? Cried Charlie, laughing. Oh, you just wait and see. So that is the end of the book. I know that there is a second book, a sequel. So we have Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and then there is actually a second book that follows up, and it's called The Glass Elevator. So if you're interested in that, I do have that one, and I can definitely let you borrow it. It kind of follows up. It says, now that he's won the Chocolate Factory, what's next for Charlie? And you kind of learn a little bit more about Charlie. And I've actually never read that one, so I might have to read it myself. But that is the end of it. Charlie won the factory by being a good, honest, kind boy. He followed directions and did what he was supposed to, and he didn't get in trouble. And that earned him the factory in the end. The others, who were kind of greedy and mean and rude, they lost the chance of the factory because of how they acted. So your actions often say a lot, and you can get extra fun stuff in life. I don't know. So that is the end of the book. I hope that you all enjoyed it. You do have to finish the last little bit of your comprehension packet, and that is in the other video that I've posted. If you have any questions or would like to borrow that book, let me know. Keep up the fantastic work, and soon it'll be summer. Bye.